Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and for several months now we've been walking you through a bunch of Bible decodes of various flavors, but for quite a while now we've been focusing on the work of Michael Menesgotz, M-E-N-A-S-G-O-T-Z, who has a new book. It's called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians were the three emperors that ruled Rome from 69 to 96 AD. It includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And according to Menesgotz and many other authors, they wrote the New Testament. At least according to Menesgotz, they wrote the Gospels. He has some questions about Paul, the Pauline epistles, and maybe other parts of the New Testament also, but definitely the Gospels. And the Romans did this, according to this theory, that the Romans did this as a psychological operation or psychological warfare against the Jews. The Romans had just come out of a war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. Vespasian was the first general to fight in that war, brought in by Nero, Emperor Nero, in about 66 AD, and his son Titus took over as the general, primary general for that war in about 69 or 70 AD, when his father Vespasian was appointed to be the new emperor of Rome in 69. And they wrote the Gospels, backdating them by 40 years. And the reason why they wrote them is they wanted to mellow out the Jews, to neutralize or tame or domesticate or prune the Jews. Because for over a century, the Jews had been one big pain in the butt for the Romans. The Romans pretty much took over in Judea around 63 BC, and there was one war after another, after an insurrection, after a revolution, after an uprising, after a riot. Because the Jews weren't like most of the other people under the umbrella of the Roman Empire. The Romans tried to really absorb everybody into their empire, including their religions. But the Jews weren't going for that, because the Jews had a monotheistic religion with a belief that they were the chosen people. So they were very xenophobic and separatists, and their God was jealous and zealous and obsessive compulsive and control freak and insecure and relatively weak and addicted to smoke of mostly of dead animals. And so he required dead humans in some cases as well. But so he required a lot of animal sacrifices and circumcisions and kosher food laws that were quirky and idiosyncratic. And he insisted on no graven images. And so these were all things that were made the Jews very high maintenance for the Romans. The Romans also understood that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. There were all kinds of predictions and prophecies coming from the Old Testament, from the Torah, and from the histories, and from the prophets, and from the poetry of the Old Testament, that a Messiah was on his way. But the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for was a military Messiah who was going to come in and overthrow the whoever was in charge in Jerusalem and Judea. At first, it was the Babylonians. Or before that, it was, all of these various tribes, the Philistines and the Jebusites and so on. And then the Babylonians and the Persians and the Seleucid Greeks, and then the Romans. So they were waiting for somebody to overthrow the Romans. And 3 candidates stepped forward in about 66 AD. Simon, John, and Eleazar. They were the 3 Jewish zealots that led the uprising that kicked out the Herod puppet government of Judea. And they fled to Rome. That's when Nero called for Vespasian and brought him in to lay siege to Jerusalem. And Vespasian and his son Titus were both wounded in this war. So after it was over, they decided that they would try to create this psychological warfare against the Jews by telling a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar, to walk an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, to turn the other cheek on oppression, to believe that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and to implore his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. And at the very same time, to overturn the tables of the Jewish money changers outside the temple, who were exchanging Roman money with graven images all over them for the Jewish money, so that the Jews could bring the money into the temple. And disrupting the commerce of the Jews who were out there selling pigeons and doves so that they could use them for their animal sacrifice rituals inside the temple. So in other words, Jesus took direct aim at the Jewish rituals, while at the same time being pro-Roman in every aspect. That is the sign of a psychological operation. And that's just one piece of evidence. There is so much more. The Romans had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on publishing. They had a monopoly on distribution. They were the only people who could have published and distributed the New Testament without it being censored. And they spoke and wrote in Greek, which is the language of the New Testament. Unlike the Jewish Israelite followers of Jesus, who would have been speaking Aramaic. And only the most elite of them would have spoken spoken in Greek, and probably not written in Greek. So, the fact that the New Testament is written in Greek originally is already strike one. But then all of the motives of the Romans, the MO of the Romans created a number of other religions in the first century. Titus himself created 2 other religions, at least 2 other religions. And if you include rabbinical Judaism, that would really be, Vespasian mostly created that. So this was right down their alley. The Romans were masters of psychological operation. They were also masters of riddles and codes and wordplay and aliases and shell games with words and names and switching languages, puns. These were all amusements for the Romans. And they are all brought to bear in the New Testament. What they did is they backdated the story of the New Testament by 40 years. And then, as a companion piece to the Gospels, they wrote a history that is called the War of the Jews. And this covers the Jewish War from 66 to 73 AD, with the heroes being Titus and Vespasian. And Vespasian enthusiastically endorsed this book, which was written under the name or the pseudonym or the alias of Josephus. Josephus tells us in his autobiography that he was a member of the Roman royal family by adoption. He lived at Caesar's palace in a townhouse that he was appointed by Vespasian as the court historian of the Romans. And his name is Flavius Josephus, of the Flavian emperors. And so they wrote Josephus and they wrote the Gospels. And if you read them together, you will have whiplash with deja vu, because there are so many parallels between the 2 of them that it's pretty difficult not to find them. Although some of them are quite well hidden, but there are many different themes that put them into relief. One of the themes is that Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea. War of the Jews describes Titus's military campaign. He goes from one place to another, fighting a battle here, having an adventure there, overcoming such and such a thing there, being found without his armor on, in another place, one after another. All of the places that Titus goes, and all of the adventures that Titus has, Jesus also has. Jesus goes to the same places as Titus in the same order. And where they have adventures or events, they are the same, except that they are only the same typologically or conceptually. They're not exactly the same, but they have the same kind of themes that run through them. And that's what Michael Menescotz does in his book, is he digs into the book of Luke, the 3rd gospel, and compares it with War of the Jews by Josephus. He found 250 parallels in the book of Luke with War of the Jews. Some of them are tangential and minor and even possibly a reach, or could easily be dismissed as coincidental. Some of them are devastatingly strong, where they will like literally knock your socks off because you can't believe how many separate parallels are in one paragraph of each book. How many themes are almost exactly the same, and you can see the mean-spirited nature of the Romans mocking the Jews and anybody else who believes this New Testament, and insulting them and ridiculing them and accusing them of heinous actions. And you can see the Romans laughing at them. So Menescot's found 250 parallels. That's over 10 per chapter of Luke. And he goes over all of them in this book. Now, some of them, again, are strong. Some of them are weak. Many of them, all of them, you could ultimately probably almost all of them, maybe 5 of them are so obvious and stand out so hard that you're left scratching your head. But most of the rest of them, you could dismiss them as being coincidental if there weren't so many of them. I mean, if there were just 2 or 3 of them, you could be like, oh yeah, well, that's just, that's just a coincidence that they use these same themes in the same order at the same place. But when there are 250 of them, that doesn't work anymore. But not only that Menescot graphed them out. He put the book of Luke on the vertical axis, and he put the War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Wherever he found a parallel, he plotted the point there. He put a dot there or a star there. After plotting 250 points, you can see 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, which are A, P, T, V, S. Now, I'm pretty sure that the TVS is Titus Vespasianus. And it is an imprint that they actually used on some Roman coins during their reigns. TVS, or at least VS, connected with the T. And then the AP is either named after Arius Piso or Aegian Numa. Arius Piso was kind of a shadow character that was kind of the shadow emperor of Rome under Titus and Vespasian. Or Aegian Numa, which means Holy Spirit, which would mean then Father and Son, Father Vespasian, Son Titus, Holy Spirit, AP. Not sure which it is, but the main point is that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they literally signed their name to it. And so makes it very difficult to dismiss. It goes way beyond any type of Q-proof or dig research coincidences that you are. How many coincidences does it take before you don't say it's a coincidence anymore? How many standard deviations are we talking about? We're talking about a bunch of standard deviations. I know once you get, past 3 or 4 standard deviations, the odds are incredibly minuscule. We are definitely, way, I think, very far beyond any type of doubt that this goes beyond coincidence. And when you add in the motive and the MO and the monopolies and the language, then you start interpreting some of these parallels and just the mean-spirited nature and the mocking and ridiculing, it's all intentional. And they wanted to be discovered eventually. not during their lifetimes, but eventually. And I don't think that they thought it was going to take this long. But now it's over, and we have discovered this. Okay, so let's start up here. He just got done citing a few more parallels, but he's looking at the parallels in the A and the P, which are much weaker than the parallels in the TVS, which make you think that the parallels in the A and the P might have been written in later, possibly by a later emperor, possibly by Domitian, or maybe by Arius Piso, but probably after Titus and Vespasian had died in 81 AD. The parallels in the V and the S are there are much more of them, and they kind of go both ways. Sometimes the Gospels are mocking War of the Jews. Sometimes the Jewish war is mocking the Gospels. And the parallels are just much more detailed, intricate, and put together with great care. But the ones in the A and the P are a lot of times are just kind of slapped together. Okay, so there are more to come, but with one exception that I will show later, they don't seem to contain interesting hidden messages. They are weaker parallels compared to the ones found on the left-hand side, which I think is really the right-hand side of the AP-TVS pattern. You can see the pattern in the thumbnail to the video. However, despite being clearly weaker, they are still what stands out when you look for parallels between this section of Jewish war and Luke, and that's what matters. I suppose a critic might seek to dismiss all these parallels on the basis that they are considerably weaker, but that doesn't trouble me greatly. This is because even if they dismiss the parallels described in this chapter, got to flip the page here. Almost there. That critic has a second problem. If the critic argues that the magnificent parallels I found in the second half of Jewish war regarding the T, V, and the S are not so impressive that they couldn't all be coincidences, then why is it that we are unable to find many similarly impressive ones within the first half of Jewish war? You cannot have it both ways. Both halves of Jewish war should contain parallels with Luke that are reasonably comparable in number and strength. The fact that those in the second half are much more numerous, but also are often more impressive, shows that they are not coincidences. But even if the critic ignores this logic somehow, it doesn't change that the TVS is painfully apparent, and by themselves these letters offer a signature that commoners of the AD 70s AD, could be led to believe to relate to their famous Flavian rulers, Titus and Vespasian. Or possibly just Titus, Titvs. The V and the U are interchangeable in Latin. And then the critic still, and also, you know, I haven't mentioned that with those parallels between the ministry of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus, many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are literally in the words of Josephus of War of the Jews in the history. They are fulfilled by Titus. Titus fulfills over a dozen of Jesus's prophecies. So what that means is that Jesus is the prophet. Titus is the second coming. So, you know, we're not looking for a second coming now. And, you know, reading our Apocalypse of John, of the book of Revelation. That's already happened. And it's in black and white in the words of Josephus in his history called War of the Jews. Titus fulfilled the prophecies of Jesus. Now, there are a few other prophecies that Jesus made that are fulfilled by other people in the War of the Jews as well. Anyway, and then the critic still has a third problem, which is that even though these parallels are weaker, the strongest parallels present in this section of Jewish war nonetheless happen to preferentially form a thin and densely populated and perfectly straight diagonal line when their locations are plotted. This is a useful feature of the data, since it is quite easy to evaluate the feasibility that a straight diagonal line with more or less that location and angle could occur by chance. I say more or less that location and angle since, in view of the other lines of parallels identified, it's clearly an A that we are looking at. And with the requirement to fit the other letters, there's very little room to position the A much differently than as we find it. A more advanced analysis would consider additional evidence, such as the shape of the entire structure of the 5 letters, APTVS. But I will settle here for a simple analysis using just a subset of the available evidence, since it turns out to be perfectly sufficient. But before I get to that analysis, I will describe the rest of the parallels on the right-hand side of the A, which are set out through the rest of this chapter. Okay, here's one. Jewish War 93, Book 1, Chapter 13, Paragraph 9. The high priests who officiated officiated the Passover had to be without blemish, but Hyrcanus had his ears bitten off, so he could never again officiate. That's pretty interesting. And that is copied or parodied or paralleled by Luke 23, verses 3 and 4. Jesus is implied as being king of the Jews, deemed to be without fault. Clarifying, Peter reaffirms, 1 Peter reaffirms the meaning of this, clarifying that Jesus was a lamb without fault and without blemish. And he is found to deemed to be without fault by Pilate. So there's a parallel, without blemish and high priests officiating. Okay, Jewish War 94, the next paragraph. And he prevented all abuses by deliberately dashing his head against a stone. Paralleled by Luke 20, 17, 18. The stone the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Whoever falls on that stone shall be broken, but on who it falls, it will grind to powder. Jewish War 97. After Herod escaped the plot to kill him, he visited Cleopatra, and then, being neither frightened at the height of a sudden storm, nor at the tumults that were now in Italy, he sailed for Rome and asked Antony for assistance, telling him how he had sailed to him through a storm to do so. And this is Luke 21, 25, and 26 and 36. And there shall be signs, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts falling for fear. Watch ye therefore and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape. Yeah, that one is pretty weak. Signs, the sea and the waves, not really. Sudden storm and the tumults. So I guess that could be sea and the waves. And sailing through a storm. Not so much. I think that one's pretty weak. So anyway. Jewish War 102. Despite Antigonus bribing others, Herod remained powerful. So Herod went to Jerusalem via Galilee, collecting reinforcements. Luke 19:11. Jesus said a parable about a nobleman seeking to obtain a country and giving money for his servants to occupy it. because he was nigh to Jerusalem. There's not much there either. He admitted that these are weak. These are just there to put a dot there. These are the ones that you find after you already figured out the pattern. This is Jewish War 105. Herod begged Silo's captains not to leave him, and then plundered Jericho. A great multitude of armed men were gathered together about Jericho, and lay upon the mountains to watch those that brought the provisions. And this is matched up with Luke 18:35. Jesus went to Jericho. A certain blind man sat by the wayside begging. And hearing the multitude pass by, he asked what it meant. Okay, so that's got Jericho, begging, and a great multitude. So I'd say that's a legit parallel. Nothing to knock your socks off, but certainly enough to put a dot there. Okay, I think we'll stop there. And thanks for tuning in. And like, share, subscribe. And have a great day. Come back tomorrow for the next set of decodes.